Hi, my name is Jonathan Arneault with FuelTrust. Today we're going to talk about de-risking some of the disadvantages to data sharing, and particularly from a maritime industry perspective. I want to begin first by letting you know that the fundamentals of data sharing typically aren't said in those words. What you'll hear are things like transparency or integration or ability to transact in a faster and cleaner way. You're going to hear words that talk about transactions and words about commerce, but the reality is that underlying all of that is the component of having information being exchanged in a secure way between counterparties. And that means data sharing, data going from one party to another or being accessible in a centralized, shared source of truth. And so, underlying that, what that really means and what's driving that is the desire to transact more clearly, more transparently, and with a higher degree of trust. And those two words, transparency and trust, have become critical components of commerce globally in every industry. And so that should beg a certain question that you probably have thought, or your management has thought, or your senior executives, or if you are the senior executive, you have thought. So if I'm sharing information, what risks do I have? What do I share? How do I make sure when I share data or when I publish data that only those that I want to see it can see it, and they can only see the pieces that they should? In other words, how do I secure when I've let information go outside my four walls that it only goes to where I want it to go and never goes beyond that, and only those within that other constituency, that other counterparty, can see it? And those are the core questions around data sharing. That is the underlying risk of data sharing. And some examples of things that should be shared or want to be shared in the maritime and shipping industry are things like ship operational assessments. There are class societies and there are organizations that do those assessments, but I don't want those things leaking out into the open world because things change and they do provide me some insight about my operation, my costs. Things like fuels and environmental, social, and governance compliance, those records could create some sort of liability or advantage to me. So I do want to share, but only within certain constructs. Things like crew changes and certifications can also become both an advantage and a potential liability for me if I share them in ways that are non-secure. Things like bill of ladings and manifest have tremendous commercial value if I share them, and yet it's very difficult to do so because of the exchange of reliable information between parties. And then things like engineering and safety records and the annual inspections on every vessel that's on the blue water fleet and brown water fleet. So these are some things that end up wanting to be shared. And we are at a pivotal change point in the industry. The last 2 years, really spurred on by COVID, but also by commercial demands, is this race to digitization. And that is healthy and helpful because it really enables not only data sharing, but insight, understanding, and actionable capability to what's happening in our fleets and the supply chain, and even all the way down to our customer delivery chain. So some examples of things that today are highly digitized and becoming more so are things like port controls, cargo management at ports and to and from ports. Cargo manifest is nearly digital, nearly universally digital. Voyage management and optimization is trending toward digital. There's lots of companies out there providing that today. Things like crew certifications and crew management are digital or are driving toward digital. And day reports are primarily digital today, even though that is resulting from manual entry on the ship or after the fact. And so what's not yet digital or not yet getting to digital are things like crew changes, optimization for crews, health and well-being measurements for crew. Things like ship asset management and ship maintenance are after the fact recording, typically recorded on paper and then put into a log or a spreadsheet somewhere. Things like fuel quality data are mostly not digital, or they are entered in after the fact. They're exchanged primarily as PDFs, and that's not digital, that's just simply an image. Things like fuel stem and fuel delivery data are after the fact recording or rekeying there. So there's not a digital sharing mechanism for those primarily in the market today. Fuel usage and the carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, black carbon, the NOx values, the SOx values, the data may have after the fact recording. In most cases, those are estimates driven out of spreadsheets. And there's not a lot of digitization there. And even where we have IoT sensors, again, those are being captured at points in time and they are after the fact lagging indicators. And then we have things like bills of lading, which the industry is really trying to drive toward, but it's quite spotty. And so understand that the two major drivers in the maritime industry today, where the money is flowing, is in digitization and decarbonization. Both of those highly impactful trends rely on open data sharing in a trusted and transparent environment, and yet have permissioned privacy. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. So data sharing, you need to understand, is profitable. It helps drive the monetization of decarbonization, not just a good idea, but something that helps your fleets be more profitable. If you're a fuel supplier or one of the suppliers to the maritime industry, the data sharing around decarbonization from all sources makes opportunity for further monetization of your efforts and investments. Data sharing drives compliance cost cutting. It allows you to reduce the cost and efforts in reporting your compliance or driving future compliance. It helps to identify fuel fraud and fuel compatibilities, which is somewhere in the range of $10 billion in loss to the industry annually. By data sharing, we're able to identify and reduce those fuel frauds and fuel non-compatibility issues. And we actually, as you can see, over 50% of the costs of operating most vessels is in fuels. And so data sharing allows us to reduce those costs and the risks associated with purchasing fuels from various sources. And those are just some examples of driving profitability via data sharing. And so what are some of the risks in data sharing? Well, firstly is once data is out in the wild, there is the constant risk or fear of a dragnet legal inquiry pulling in some of your data along with somebody else's, or someone just saying, you've got it out there digitally, give it all to me. And that is a risk that could be possible. There is the constant and the very real risk of once I push my data outside my four walls or I digitize it and put it out there, that once it's in somebody else's hands, what are they going to do with it? And I will tell you today, one of the problems of the maritime industry is emailing PDFs everywhere and trusting that everybody's going to hold on to their NDAs, and yet there could be data leakage out there. How do I ensure the privacy of my information even when I've made it available to others? That is a very real risk in data sharing. The next is the counterparty demands. And what I mean by that is your customer, once they start getting a little bit of information, they want a whole lot more, and or they want that same information in 15 different variations. Or you have 15 different counterparties that want each of them want that data provided to them or shared with them in a differing manner, in a different time frames, in a different controls, and et cetera, et cetera. Those cost drivers or cost demands of you can go up and up and up across your customer base. So that is a risk. And then there's the technology costs and the variations of technologies. It's very real. I'm going to produce information this way, and yet how do I get that to the varying points? How do I do integration between my many systems? How do I get information that does not require heavy manual lifting, both to produce it and to project it outside my organization and share it? And then there's the privacy regulations, not just personal information, but financial information, regulatory information, et cetera, all of which, if you are producing, you need to have a way in which you can control those. And in the right to be forgotten, the private information, personal information, you do also need to comply with EU rules, California rules, several countries in Asia. In the US, you've got California rules. So how do you deal with all of these different privacy regulations? Canada, UK versus EU versus Germany in the EU versus Russia versus... These are issues that you need to have being dealt with as part of data sharing. They are risks, and every one of them can be addressed. So what are some of the mechanisms of data sharing? Well, the most common in the world today is just private file exchanges. Data is produced, such as in the petroleum industry, on a daily basis. And not just one file, but many, many files coming from different refineries, downstreams, pipeline producers, etc. And they are then dealt with much like banking records, where there is a reconciliation of them against all the others, and the data goes out there, and there are non disclosure agreements and a trust that these files will be used, and they tend to calcify, become very settled over time. And yet, their accessibility and the value of them, while early on was high, goes lower and lower. And then, as it says here on the slide, data can be forwarded once it's shared. The next are things like cooperative networks, and this is where many providers or counterparties get together and they exchange over some private network using some private protocol or some private file format or data format. And they are encrypting data in transit, and then it lands in their databases, and then there's no control of that data's encryption or privacy once it's landed in those various sources. That is a risk of that model. Then there are electronic data interexchanges. This is probably the longest and most prolific way of sharing data. It is well known and well utilized across the commercial supply chain, and there is a high degree of security as it goes over the network. And yet it provides only fixed business process flexibility. There is flexibility as long as you can attach to any one of the predefined business processes out there. Highly valuable in well-defined things such as an EDI or EDIFACT, etc., and yet not really fungible as it goes between different types of business arrangements, or you need to want to innovate. The most prolific over the last 10 years has been called API to API programming, or API-based interfaces. Highly flexible and yet also very expensive. The first time it's easy. But when I want to integrate 50 different systems or 50 different customers, that means I have 50 different programming models to go through, 50 different projects, and 50 different maintenance points for those 50 customers. Likewise, if I have 50 customers each programming to me, they're going to have 50 suppliers and their costs. So that has the network effect in a negative sense in cost and integration. And then lastly, and this is relatively recent, in the last 7 years, we've seen cloud application exchanges. And this is where we've got companies that take the functions that you're wanting and putting those out there and trying to integrate a network. They're very much like an EDI exchange, except they have a programming model to them. You are relying on that cloud application to provide the security, and it provide a hub and spoke model to share data. There's value in every one of these, and there are some costs or detriments to each one of these, and it's a trade-off that you need to decide. And then there are taking any one of the above and outsourcing it to a provider, such as one of the big four integration firms, a specialized industry provider, etc. And then there are, it has become much more prolific, but not totally prolific, blockchain applications or smart contracts. And these are coded between you and counterparties. It really does look a lot like a private file exchange. It looks like an API to API programming. It looks like an electronic data exchange, and yet it's very bespoke, and there is value there. But what we're seeing, and that really has been over the last, really become for a blockchain project. You've seen those over the last 3 years with great success, and then some non-success, just because they are projects. They require a whole lot of counterparty sign-offs and integration. But what we are finding today are these multifunctional blockchain networks. We are participating in one called the Blockchain for Energy Network, and they have predefined smart contracts between one another. There are a number of providers in the Houston area that are blockchain as a service companies that have predefined blockchain smart contracts for industry. We at our company provide applications that have predefined blockchain functionality that allows you to onboard. This is an excellent mechanism because it prevents data forwarding. Only those that have access to the information have access to it, and they can only have access to it via their blockchain and via their encryption keys. Encryption is over the wire, encryption is while it's stored, encryption is in access and in the interaction of data across the varying backend systems. The processes, the business processes, the logic processes are highly flexible. And then more importantly, when you have these multifunctional blockchain networks, you can actually build applications, human and or system applications, that access those things to get even greater business value. And so see, these are some of the ways that you can solve the data sharing problem. A multifunctional blockchain network is really the combination of all of the above while taking away a number of the negatives of any of the above. It does have issues. It still has work that has to be done, and you still have to have parties that join it. However, much of the work that is required of the top items are done when you utilize a multifunctional blockchain network, especially if you do so with a front-end application. So when I began to look across this, we found this interesting thing. I quoted this at a seminar, a forum over the summer, and it really struck me and stuck with me, is that the reason people are afraid is because when they look around, everyone is afraid. And there's reasons for that, and I highlighted some of those above, and yet there is a groupthink that occurs of if everybody's afraid to share, then everybody should be afraid to share. And so our company, what we do is we help fuel trust around data sharing and by creating privacy or private transparency. There is trust and transparency between counterparties, yet keeping that data private through a permission model. And I'm not here to sell you, but I'll use what we're doing as an example. So we address the carbon concern. We address the issues of getting trade financing around Poseidon principles and the ship cargo principles. We address the insurance and underwriting concern of the long-term carbon cost and/or potential future lawsuits. We deal with the cargo charterer demand to get real-time access to their carbon footprint when they ship goods or liquids, etc. We help lower the cost of compliance verification through data sharing in a permission private way, and we help lower the costs of carbon taxes and reporting. One of the things that you all have known is that with the coming changes in ESG and carbon reporting, if you can't validate what you're doing, the current estimates out of the EPA and the MRV or MERV are estimates, and now we're seeing us press to get to more and more exacting truth, and that's going to require data sharing across it. It's becoming more and more expensive to operate if you are not within a certain threshold, and very soon if you're not able to validate the changes or corrections that you've made. Tremendous efforts and results have been made in maritime shipping and decarbonization, and yet now it's time to prove it. And so what that means is that your customers and your company and your upstream are beginning to worry about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. This means there's an entire supply chain or creation chain of CO2. And the only way to address the creation and sequestration chain of CO2 is through data sharing, transparency and traceability of CO2 when it's created, when it's ameliorated, and when it is sequestered. And so we try to address this along with others in a certain way. Our products, and again, I'm not selling, I'm showing you a model of data sharing, function across a multifunctional blockchain network. We run a hybrid blockchain network integrating with others. And what you're seeing here in the top across the blockchain as data, as information is created from the refiner to the midstreams, to the supplier, to the finally across the delivery barge, to the ship owners, and then the eventual cargo shippers, is varying information that is being produced, being written to the blockchain. It's written securely, encrypted, stored encrypted, access encrypted. Every access and every change to it is logged and encrypted on the blockchain, step by step. The blockchain becomes the integration mechanism for information, and it becomes the security and access logging mechanism for information. We share via the blockchain, and you can share any data type via the blockchain. We further, as data moves through, begin to enhance or add other information. So once it comes to a supplier, one of the requirements is as a stem comes from the supplier tanks to the delivery barge is the barge delivery node. That's a little bit different than the bunker delivery node. So we've got the information for that stem attached with the 8217, the COQ information, etc. And that is all written into the blockchain. And yes, there's a lot of logic that our application, Bunker Insight, adds to that. Then as that fuel moves, additive information comes from the delivery barge. And then we're recording that via, either the paper BDN or our universal eBDN, and adding information about fuel flows, the alongside time, all of the MARPOL security and health sign-offs. All of that happens as the fuel moves from delivery barge to the ship owner. And then the sign-off of the receipt of that also is written to the blockchain. And then the ship stamp and the acceptance of the samples and the sample information coming from the labs all get written into the blockchain so that it's accessible to each of the parties that need to see it. And then our back-end system ends up actually analyzing the molecules of the fuel as it moves across that blockchain network, as the actual fuel moves from the refiner to the pipeline to the midstream to the blender to the supplier, all the way till it gets to the engine in that ship tank and ends up in the bunkers. When it gets into the day tank and then flows through the engine, we show the combustion of the CO2, the real measurements, not just estimating, as that engine runs, and then we report that to the blockchain, which is a value to the ship owner, it's a value to the fuel supplier, and then becomes valuable to those cargo shippers where they can automatically have reported their portion of their CO2 burden for that voyage the very day that cargo is delivered, as opposed to the cost on the ship owner of running through spreadsheets and running estimates and paying other services, et cetera. The cargo shipper pays for that, and they get access as permitted by the ship owner. The blockchain that we produce and others may produce, and then the applications adding value to that data in the blockchain. That symbiosis there provides a transparent, trusted single source of truth across all counterparties. So again, here you see an example of data sharing in the real world that provides value to all of those that both share and need to have shared information in a blockchain. And so that application I just talked about, Bunker Insights, that integrates to that blockchain, it leverages capabilities, logic outside the blockchain that enhances the value to the blockchain. Now, I'm not trying to sell you on blockchain. I'm trying to talk to you about data sharing and de-risking it, because the information that is in that network is secured and it allows you to transport any type of information. This allows you, your company, your counterparties to be able to exchange information, to log and understand and secure who accesses what and when they access it and what happened to it, and to control the permissions of how they get it, how they accessed it, what they do with it, and keeping them from sharing it outside, including avoiding dragnet searches after the fact. And so there is a tremendous value in data sharing, and the capabilities are available off the shelf, not only from our company, but in the technology realm as a whole, in order to de-risk the risks of data sharing and yet still receive the values, the enhanced values of data sharing in every part of your companies. I've left here the glyph that has my cell phone information, my email information. I'm Jonathan Arneault with FuelTrust, and I look forward to meeting you soon.